The summer heat of July 1972 pressed down on New York City like a restless hand. Even before the doors of Madison Square Garden opened, the sidewalks outside were thick with people. Vendors shouted, selling souvenir programs that would later yellow with time. Fans clutched posters and bootleg photographs, eager to prove they had seen Elvis Presley in the flesh. Inside, the garden transformed into something almost alive. 20,000 bodies packed shoulder to shoulder. A current of anticipation running through the air. The smell was unmistakable. Popcorn and hot dogs mingled with cologne and cigarette smoke. Every sound seemed magnified. The buzz of chatter, the scratch of folding chairs, the testing thrum of amplifiers. Spotlights swept across the crowd, teasing the stage, pulling cheers even before a single chord had been struck. The setlist whispered from fan to fan, promised a mix of the old and the new. That's all right. Proud Mary, maybe even suspicious minds, if the night ran long. For many, this was the concert of a lifetime, Elvis's long-awaited return to New York, a city he had not played since the 1950s. At 9:15 p.m., the lights dropped without warning. A roar rose from the floor to the rafters, a wave so loud it rattled the very girders of the garden. Out of the darkness came the opening notes of Also Sprach Zarathustra, a theme that had already become Elvis's signature call to arms. When the king appeared in his white rhinestone-studded jumpsuit, the flashbulbs burst like fireworks. Cameras clicked so furiously it sounded like a storm of rain. The sight was blinding, rhinestones catching the beams, glittering like a field of broken stars. He adjusted his wide belt, gave a half smile, and with a single nod, the TCB band kicked in. The stage shook beneath the thunder of drums, bass, and brass. The crowd screamed, stood, waved their arms in unison. 20,000 voices became one organism, living and breathing to the rhythm of the music, and yet, beneath the roar, something unexpected flickered at the edge of perception. A note that didn't belong. A sound not of celebration, but of distress. It was faint at first, almost drowned by the guitars, but it carried in a way only fear can. Somewhere in the mass of bodies, a child's cry pierced the night. Most didn't hear it. Some thought it was just feedback, or another scream among thousands. But a few heads turned, then more. Confusion rippled like a shadow across the audience. The music thundered on, but unease had been planted, threading itself into the noise. Who expects silence in the middle of 20,000 people? The crowd was about to find out. At first, the cry seemed swallowed by the chaos. Elvis had launched into That's All Right, his voice steady, his hips moving in the rhythm that had ignited a generation. But in section 112, the sound cut through like a blade. A woman's voice rose above the music, sharp, panicked, desperate. My boy, somebody help me, my boy. Security guards, dressed in dark jackets and positioned at the aisles, exchanged glances. Frank Johnson, a veteran usher known for his calm under pressure, turned his head toward the commotion. He saw her, a mother scanning row after row, her hands trembling as she shouted again. Her cries weren't the cries of fandom. They were the cries of fear, and there, just a few seats away, stood the reason. A child no older than 5, small enough to be swallowed whole by the towering bodies around him. He clutched nothing, not even a coat or a program, only his own tears streaking his cheeks. His hair stuck damp to his forehead. He did not move. He did not scream like the others. He stood frozen, as if the entire garden was some monstrous ocean and he had lost his raft. The audience noticed. Gasps replaced cheers in that section. Fingers pointed. Whispers rose. Is he alone? Where's his family? The music continued, but the illusion of untouchable performance was fraying. Even in the upper balconies, people began sensing something was wrong. It was as though the garden itself had drawn a collective breath and held it. Frank motioned to two other guards. Keep the crowd calm, he barked, even as his own voice shook. They moved toward the boy, but the space between the rows was tight, the fans unwilling to budge. Confusion and frustration sparked voices clashing in the dark, arguing whether the show should go on. And then came the question hanging unspoken in the air. If Elvis saw what was happening, would he continue? Or would he stop? In front of 20,000 people, every second of hesitation mattered. Imagine being that mother. Would you want the music to roar on as if nothing had happened? Or would you want the world, every light, every voice, to stop until your child was safe? The band played softer, unsure of themselves. The crowd's roar dimmed to a murmur. Elvis turned his head slightly, his eyes catching the movement near section 112. He adjusted the microphone in his hand, his expression unreadable. The cameras snapped, unaware they were about to capture something far greater than a song. Every gaze in Madison Square Garden turned not to the stage, but to him. All eyes waited for the king's answer. Frank Johnson pushed through the row, his shoulders brushing fans who refused to give ground. The boy stood rigid, tears carving lines through the noise. The mother's cries rose again, higher, pleading. The music still rolled forward, but now it sounded like a machine running without oil, straining. Uneasy, wrong. Elvis gripped the microphone. His left foot tapped the edge of the riser, not in rhythm but in thought. He scanned the crowd, his gaze sweeping like a searchlight. Somewhere out there, one child's terror outweighed the thunder of 20,000 cheers. The crowd sensed it too. The air thickened, restless, confused. Security argued in hurried tones. "Get him out fast," one muttered. Another said, "We can't disrupt the stage." Not in front of the press. The cameras were rolling, journalists scribbling notes. Every decision carried weight. If they drew too much attention, panic could ripple. If they ignored it, shame would stain the night forever. The band faltered, lowering the volume. The brass line died into a hollow echo. The drummer, unsure, softened his sticks to a whisper. The audience began to sway uneasily, their energy shifting from celebration to uncertainty. 20,000 heartbeats pounded faster, waiting for something, anything to break the tension. The boy sobbed harder. His cries no longer belonged to one section. They carried upward, bouncing off concrete, audible even to those in the back rows. The mother's voice cracked as she shouted his name again. Each syllable clawed at the garden's noise, stripping away the illusion of a flawless night. Imagine being one of those fans. You bought a ticket for music, for spectacle, and suddenly you're confronted with a child's raw fear. Would you keep cheering? Or would you fall quiet, knowing that sound could make rescue harder? The whispers grew. "He's too young. Stop the music. What's Elvis going to do?" This wasn't just background chatter anymore. It was a rising tide. The crowd was becoming its own force, not just an audience, but a jury. Demanding an answer, Frank reached the boy at last, kneeling low. "You're all right, son," he said gently, though sweat lined his forehead. He extended a hand, but the boy clung to his own chest, shaking his head. Fear locked him in place. Frank looked up toward the stage, helpless, searching for a cue. Elvis leaned forward, his face tense. He adjusted his guitar strap, let his right hand drop from the strings. His eyes narrowed, catching the scene, fixing on a small figure surrounded by giants. The music was still playing, but faint now, background noise against something larger. The band looked to Elvis, uncertain if they should stop or stumble on. The crowd hushed itself, as if afraid of drowning out his decision. What mattered more now, the illusion of the performance or the humanity of the moment? The weight of that choice settled on one man holding a microphone. Then, slowly, Elvis set his guitar aside. His hand rose, palm open, cutting the music like a blade. The arena went dead silent. The silence that followed was unlike anything Madison Square Garden had ever known. Just moments earlier, the roof had shaken with sound. Now, 20,000 people sat suspended in breathless quiet. Elvis stood center stage, one hand still raised, his white jumpsuit glowing. Under the spotlights, his voice carried into the hush, low but commanding. "Hold on. Bring him here." Frank Johnson looked up from the aisle, startled. No protocol manual had prepared him for this. Elvis Presley was no longer a distant figure on stage. He was directing the rescue. The guards parted, making space, their radios useless in the quiet. The boy trembled, uncertain, as Frank gently lifted him into his arms. The child's small body seemed weightless, but the moment was heavy with meaning. Elvis stepped down from the riser, microphone trailing in his hand. Each movement drew gasps. Stars weren't supposed to break the invisible barrier between stage and crowd. Yet here he was, walking into the audience, rhinestones flashing like beacons. He met Frank halfway. The guard extended, the child toward him, and for a second the world held its breath. Then Elvis took the boy, cradling him close as though he were family. The ovation came not as a scream, but as a rising swell, relief, or disbelief. Strangers clutched one another's shoulders, whispering, "He's safe. Elvis has him." The boy buried his face against Elvis's chest, muffling sobs. Elvis bent down, whispering a few words no microphone could catch. "Some said," he told the boy, "you're all right now." Others swore, he murmured. "Nobody hurts you tonight." The truth was less important than the compassion radiating from his voice. He turned toward the stage again, carrying the child with him. Each step seemed to echo louder than any drumbeat. The band stood frozen, instruments lowered. The spotlight followed Elvis back up the riser, illuminating a scene that no rehearsal could have scripted. When he reached center stage, Elvis set the boy gently on his feet. He knelt beside him, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. The child's wide eyes shimmered in the light, still damp with tears. The arena leaned forward as one, hanging on every gesture. Then Elvis did something simple, yet unforgettable. He untied the silk scarf from his neck, a scarf already damp with sweat, already marked by the performance, and draped it around the boy's shoulders. The boy touched it as though it were armor. A hush lingered for one heartbeat more, and then the garden erupted. This time, the ovation thundered not from spectacle, but from relief, compassion, unity. The sound shook the rafters, but it was different than before. It wasn't fandom screaming. It was humanity applauding itself. Imagine the contrast, only minutes earlier. The crowd had teetered between panic and confusion. Now, that same crowd stood together, united by one man's choice to put a child above a show. Would you have expected a superstar to risk breaking the spell of performance for a single frightened boy? Elvis rose, lifting the microphone again. His words were short, each delivered like a beat of a drum. He's safe. He's with us now. The short bursts struck deeper than any verse of music. The boy's mother, still weeping, began to push forward. Security cleared a path, guiding her to the stage. Elvis extended his hand, helping her up, then placed the boy into her arms. She clutched him, burying her face into his hair, sobs mixing with laughter. Elvis stepped back, giving them space, the spotlight holding all three in a glowing triangle. The audience was stunned. In a single gesture, Elvis had transformed the most precarious moment of the night into something legendary. And yet, the night was not finished, because as the mother wept with her child in her arms, Elvis turned back to the microphone, his eyes glistening. The crowd braced, wondering what he would do next. Elvis didn't rush back into the set. Instead, he stood still, watching the mother cradle her son at center stage. The house lights dimmed around them, leaving the three figures in a halo of white. The boy clutched the scarf tighter, its silk pooling in his tiny fists like a banner of safety. For a long moment, the garden remained suspended between silence and sound, waiting for what would follow. Elvis turned to the crowd, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Sometimes," he said, "we forget what matters most. Tonight, we've been reminded." His words carried without need of echo, resonating from the floor to the rafters. He motioned gently toward the child and his mother, then rested the microphone against his chest. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the entire city held its breath. Then, softly, he strummed the opening chords of Love Me Tender. The band joined in carefully, each note tender, restrained, as though even the instruments understood the fragility of the moment. Elvis didn't sing to the cameras or the flashing bulbs. He sang directly to the boy, his mother, and the 20,000 witnesses whose hearts had been jolted from spectacle into humanity. The effect was electric. Couples in the audience leaned closer together. Strangers clasped hands. Veterans of earlier concerts whispered, "I've never seen anything like this." The song transformed from melody into bomb, each lyric draping over the garden like a blanket. The frightened boy swayed in his mother's arms, his tears finally ebbing. Would you ever expect 20,000 people, many who had come seeking only a night of entertainment, to leave with a story that would live for decades? That night proved the power of community born from compassion. When the song ended, the ovation came not as chaos but as a rolling wave, steady and deep. People rose to their feet, applauding not just Elvis, but the reunion they had witnessed. Some fans wiped tears from their cheeks. Others hugged strangers, the lines between them dissolved. In that instant, Madison Square Garden wasn't just a venue, it was a congregation, united by an act of kindness, that the mother mouthed thank you toward Elvis, her lips trembling. Elvis nodded once, humbly, as if to say it was nothing, though every person there knew it was everything. Frank Johnson, standing at the aisle, dabbed his brow with a handkerchief, later telling reporters, "I've worked hundreds of shows, but that was the first time I saw 20,000 people breathe as one." Elvis lifted the microphone again. "Let's give this little man and his mama a round of applause," he said. The crowd obeyed instantly, clapping with an intensity that seemed to shake the wooden seats beneath them. The boy, shy but emboldened by the scarf, raised his small hand in a wave. The crowd erupted once more, voices echoing so loudly they drowned even the feedback from the speakers. The moment shifted. Fear had turned to unity, panic to pride. The garden, moments earlier on the edge of unraveling, now roared with collective joy. Elvis smiled faintly, then added, "Now, let's keep this night going. And remember, it's not just about music, it's about family." With that, he returned to the set, the band sliding seamlessly into Suspicious Minds. But the tone was different now. Every lyric seemed infused with a deeper weight, every cheer tinged with gratitude. Fans no longer heard just a performance. They carried the memory of what had just unfolded. That night didn't end with the song. It lived in the scarves fans clutched, the ticket stubs tucked into coat pockets, and in the story that began traveling from mouth to mouth before the final encore even ended. The morning after, newspapers carried headlines about Elvis's Madison Square Garden triumph. Reviewers praised his voice, his stage presence, his ability to command 20,000 fans. But tucked beneath the reviews, often in a single paragraph, was the detail that eclipsed the list. The moment when Elvis stopped everything for a lost child. Bootleg recordings circulated quickly. On grainy tapes, you could hear the band falter, the crowd hush, and then the eruption of relief when the boy was brought to the stage. Fans who hadn't been there listened in disbelief, retelling it as if it were myth. But those who stood in section 112 swore it was real, describing the boy's tears, the scarf, and the song that followed. The mother never spoke to the press, choosing privacy over publicity. Yet the boy, years later, gave a brief interview as a young man. He recalled the scarf still framed in his family's living room, its silk faded, but never forgotten. "It reminded me," he said softly, "that kindness can stop the world." Inside Madison Square Garden itself, ushers like Frank Johnson told the story long after Elvis had left the stage. "That night," Frank said, "proved we weren't just working a concert. We witnessed a piece of history. The garden became a living archive, its walls echoing not just with sound checks and rehearsals, but with the memory of a frightened child who had once been calmed by the most famous singer in the world." Isn't it remarkable that one small disruption, a child's cry, a mother's plea, could overshadow even the most legendary set? People remembered the rhinestones, the jumpsuit, the music, yes, but above all, they remembered the silence, the scarf, and the transformation of panic into unity. Decades later, fans gathering for other shows still whispered about it in the aisles. Some claimed they were there, even if they weren't, proof that the story had passed into folklore. Elvis's concerts were many, but this one was spoken of as different, set apart, not for a flawless performance, but for a flawed night redeemed by compassion. The ripples stretched further. Fan clubs wrote newsletters celebrating the Garden Scarf Night. Photographs of Elvis kneeling with the child were reprinted in magazines. Even official retrospectives of Elvis's career occasionally highlighted the evening. Not for its sound, but for its soul. Legends are often built on spotlight and stagecraft, but this one was built on pause and silence. It was a reminder that sometimes the most enduring music is not sung, but lived by the time the final encore faded and the crowd spilled onto the New York streets. Madison Square Garden had already changed forever. 20,000 people carried not just the memory of Elvis's voice, but of the silence he commanded and the compassion he chose. The headlines the next morning couldn't capture it fully. To those who were there, the night wasn't about a concert. It was about a moment when humanity itself took center stage. Elvis had performed for millions across the globe. He had commanded armies of fans, conquered charts, and rewritten the language of popular music. But what did the world remember most from this night? Not the flawless high notes, not the glitter of rhinestones. They remembered a boy who was lost, and a star who stopped everything to make sure he was found. The moral was clear, though few spoke it aloud. Legacy is not carved from perfection. It is carved from the cracks, from the moments when the lights falter and a choice must be made. Elvis could have turned away. He could have kept the machine of spectacle rolling. But instead, he stepped into the breach, showing that greatness is measured by compassion, not applause. Have you ever asked yourself what you would have done in his place? Would you have kept singing, hoping someone else would intervene? Or would you have risked the spotlight, risked the rhythm of the night, to kneel beside a frightened child? The garden crowd left with more than ticket stubs. They left with a story that would ripple through time, a story they would tell their children and grandchildren. I was there, they'd say, the night Elvis gave a scarf to a boy and reminded 20,000 strangers what family means. That is why they went home speechless. Because for all the sound Elvis created in his lifetime, this was the night's silence said the most. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes kindness can change everything. Tell us in the comments, what's a moment of compassion you'll never forget? And don't miss our next story, another legendary night where music and humanity became one.